Awesome. Okay, welcome everybody to week 2 of How Missouri Runs Elections with Brianna Lennon. If I remember correctly, you want people to ask questions throughout, correct? Okay. So online audience, you can enter your questions into the chat and Brianna will be periodically checking that. But otherwise, enjoy and I will turn it over to you and you have your clicker. Perfect. Okay. Thank you. Enjoy.
All right. Hello. Welcome to everybody on the chat. And where's the microphone in here?
What'd you say?
Where's the microphone in here?
Great. That big box.
Oh, this. Perfect. Okay. Then I won't move from this place. I welcome everybody back. This is the second class on how elections work in Missouri. This one's going to be focused on voter registration and voter list maintenance. So I hear questions often. It's one of the most frequently asked questions that I get in the office about how we keep the voter roll up to date and how voter registration works and people that want to do voter registration drives, what's involved in that. So we're going to go through that. The PowerPoint is actually pretty short, so a lot of it's just going to be talking, but I also want to make sure that anybody that has questions has the ability to ask them. So I'm going to make sure that I have the chat open. So just feel free to drop things in as stuff comes up that you are interested in talking about. But this one is class 2 and it is an 8-week course. So voter registration will be today's sole focus about stuff. Although, again, if there's anything that you do want to make sure that I cover in this class, ask at any time. Feel free to let me know if there's a topic area that you want me to cover in a future class. So last week we talked about how all these different components are the foundation of creating an election. Voter registration is the first one. So we're going to start by just talking about the framework of how voter registration actually works. So there's 2 main federal laws that dictate how voter registration is to happen in the different states, and then also how the lists are to be maintained. So the National Voter Registration Act of 1993 was a very, very seminal act, primarily in that up to 1993, voter registration by mail was really not a thing. Up to that point, if you wanted to register to vote, you had to come in person to a county clerk's office or a local election authority. You had to register to vote in person. There was no easy or accessible way to do it except by coming directly to the person. Prior to that, there was a lot of county clerk offices that would go out into the community just so that voter registration were to happen. So now you see, different parties are registering voters. The League of Women Voters is registering people. All of those things, that was not possible until the National Voter Registration Act of 1993. One of the other big things that the National Voter Registration Act, and I'm gonna truncate it by calling it NVRA because NVRA is what most people know it as. So NVRA is just the acronym for the National Voter Registration Act. What has been, I think, in the public eye a lot has been the motor voter component of NVRA. People hear motor voter and they're not, it gets kind of garbled in translation. What it means is that when you go to do anything related to your car at the Department of Revenue, the DMV, they are going to give you the option to register to vote at the time because you are providing residence information. And the whole point of voter registration maintenance and updating is that we have at the clerk's office your current residency address. So at the federal level in 1993, Congress decided it was important enough that these government activities we were already doing, like updating your driver's license or your non-driver's license, we should just tie that to updating your voter registration too, so that you don't have to do both things in different interactions with the government. The other element that motor voter encompasses that doesn't come up as often is that the Department of Social Services, any kind of agency that's providing some sort of interaction with the public, that the public would have to sign up for and provide information, provide their ID and their residency information. Those agencies would also need to be able to offer the ability to register to vote. It's not automatic. It's not designed to be something where anytime you update that, it automatically sends the information to the county clerk's office, but it is an option that voters are supposed to get when they come to do that. It also really kind of set the floor for list maintenance. So up to this point, every state was really on its own. There was no consistency across states when it came to how you could be removed from a roll, how you could be added to a roll, how we could get your information if you had updated your address somewhere. And so the floor for MVRA and list maintenance really became, we're going to get that information from other federal agencies. We're going to make sure that the county clerk's offices are mailing something to every voter. And then we're going to make sure that nobody's going to be removed unless they don't return their mailing and they don't take action in 2 subsequent federal elections. So that is reflected, they kind of reiterated it again in the Help America Vote Act of 2002, but it's also reiterated in our own state statutes. So that kind of floor, you can do more than that. You don't have to just send out, it requires it to happen every 2 years. You can send a mailing more often than that. You can proactively reach out to voters to get them to update their information. The only thing you can't do is remove people from the voter roll without going through the process of the MVRA. And every state, like I said, had slightly different requirements. There are some states that are exempt from MVRA. And the reason they would be exempt from the MVRA is because these are same-day registration states. So North Dakota, for example, does not, it's the only state in the whole country that has no registration at all. You do not register to vote to participate in elections in North Dakota. Showing up on the day of the election to vote is when you are basically added to the roll. That's when they keep track of you. So you don't have to worry about, they don't have to worry about at the county clerk level going through this whole list maintenance process, because for them, every election is a list maintenance activity because they're working in real time. There were also a handful of states, I think 8 states, that had a similar situation, same day registration at the time the MVRA was passed. And so they were also not looped in to have to comply with MVRA because they have same day registration. We now have several other states that have same day registration. The reason they got to be exempted was because you don't have to worry about people being disenfranchised, being removed from the roll if you don't have a mechanism for being able to put them back on the roll at the same time. So if you're a state that has same day registration and you got deleted 2 weeks before election day, it's okay, because you can register to vote when you go to the polls that day. If you're in a state like Missouri and we delete you 2 weeks before election day, then the voter registration deadline is 4 weeks before election day. So if we delete you and you can't register to vote, then you are not able to participate in that election. MVRA put in guidelines that said you can't delete people that close to an election. You can't delete people 90 days before federal elections, so that people didn't get disenfranchised by however the state decided to do their list maintenance activities prior to an election. So it's a safeguard for voters, but it also is kind of a roadmap for us as election authorities on how to maintain our voter lists. After MVRA was in effect for a while, I think probably everybody in this class would remember the election, the presidential election that happened in 2000, where there were a number of questions about how the outcome, it was a very close election, how the outcome was counted, really revealed all of the outdated technology that was being used in elections, but also a lot of the inefficiencies. And so I think what most people remember is that after the 2000 election, everybody said, we need to get better voting equipment. Florida had hanging chads. We had all of these issues with all these different types of ballots. We're going to do electronic equipment. We're going to do better counting. We're going to give grants to the states, and they're going to allow their local election authorities to buy these new machines so that the vote counting process is better. And that is part of it. But also the Help America Vote Act tackled a list maintenance issue that had been kind of latent that people hadn't really been talking about. Even though we had this floor for how to maintain list maintenance to make sure that voters weren't disenfranchised, there wasn't anything that from like a system standpoint was preventing somebody from being registered twice in the same state. And at a state level, that's a real problem because, well, you can say even now you can be registered in 2 different states. You can't vote in 2 different states, but it's not illegal to be registered in more than one state. It would be very hard to be registered in Missouri and registered in, say, Montana, and then still be able to vote in both because you can't physically go to each of those. There would be things that would crop up along the way because of mail, when we mail things out, or because of in-person requirements, because every state has different requirements for things. That is certainly something that we want to avoid. And that's something that I'm going to talk about later, state to state. But it's even worse if you think about it from county to county. Because if you're registered in Boone County and Cole County, it's not hard at all to just drive 20 minutes and vote in both places on the exact same day. So the Help America Vote Act required that every state create a statewide voter registration database. And that's what we work off of now, so that when somebody in Cole County moves to Boone County, we can see their Cole County registration record and we can pull it into Boone County so that we don't have duplicates and that we don't have people registered in more than one county. It also helps with just the integrity of all of our data because if somebody is moving, we want to make sure that their whole record stays intact and their entire voter history and their entire address history stays tied to that one single record instead of having a bunch of different ones that we then would have to piece together if we were trying to put together the story of how a person registered to vote. So statewide voter registration was a big thing that really was reformed in 2002, 2003, 2004 as a result of the Help America Vote Act. It also added in this data integration piece that was lacking before when it comes to getting information from the Social Security Administration, getting information from the Department of Corrections, all of these other agencies that had their own set of data, but really had no reason to share it with election authorities because in theory, why would the Department of Corrections be thinking about voter registration? They have their own set of things that they're trying to take care of. Meanwhile, we need to make sure that people that are in Missouri currently serving a felony sentence are not on our voter roll. The only way to know that is if we have information from the Department of Corrections. At the local level, we can't require anybody to data share with us. The Help America Vote Act required a statewide integration so that every state could share in that information. And then as these laws were being passed, the Missouri legislature was keeping up our own set of election laws to mirror these federal requirements. So not only do these federal laws exist, but a mirror image of them are also in our state laws so that we can have the same requirements. Even if MVRA were to go away tomorrow, we would still have the requirements to do that list maintenance. So it's kind of just like a secondary buffer to make sure that we continue working on things. So those are the 3 main laws, or I guess more than 3 if you include all of Chapter 115, but those are the 2 main federal laws and then our state law that dictate how we do voter list maintenance and kind of creation of our voter list database. Yes, there's a question.
You'll probably get to this sooner or later, but from state to state, I remember reading something about states sharing voter information with each other and then states opting out of that?
Yes, we are going to get to that.
We're gonna get to that, okay.
This is just a framework of voter registration, and and I don't want to ignore the person in the chat either. There is a question, a couple questions about things. I will point out, one of the questions is how damaging would the loss of the Federal Election Commission be? The Federal Election Commission actually does not impact election administration. The Federal Election Commission is exclusively about campaign finance and candidates that are running. So we do not interact ever with the FEC. What we do interact with, and I didn't even mention this in here because it's not as related to voter list maintenance, but the Help America Vote Act also created the Election Assistance Commission, which we refer to as the EAC. And that is kind of like a resource clearinghouse and kind of general advisory federal agency that we use at the state level and at the local level to help us kind of like leverage things. So they have the EAC creates a voluntary set of guidelines that the manufacturers of voting equipment should follow. It's voluntary because there's no requirement that they do it, but every election equipment manufacturer does follow it because it makes good sense to. And we have a comparable state law that says that we can't buy equipment in this state if it hasn't met the voluntary requirements and gotten certification from the EAC. So the EAC is an agency that we work with on basic like best practices and different kind of like they have the ability to create things like the voluntary systems guidelines that we wouldn't be able to do on our own. So as far as I know, there have been no changes to the EAC. Everything related to the EAC is still very independent and has not had anything happen to it yet. And then actually the second question, how protected are the voting rolls? I think that's actually a very good question in relation to the statewide voter registration, because one of the advantages, and this would be the case in any state in the country, one of the advantages of the way that elections are run in the United States is that they are decentralized. There is no overarching federal voter registration list. So Missouri's voter registration list is separate than Illinois, separate from California's. They're all maintained in their own individual states. And in many cases, not all, it depends on the structure of the state, but in our case, for sure, the law, Missouri law specifically says the voter rolls are ours. They're the county's. So a voter roll belongs to the local election authority. It is housed electronically in the statewide voter registration database that the Secretary of State's office provides for us. But we are the ones that are supposed to process voter registrations, update the list, make sure that all of those things are accurate. The Secretary of State's office is not allowed to touch any of the voter registrations that are in their voter registration list. So they can tell us that we should, do things. We should maintain the voter list. They give us instructions on how to use the database and they give us trainings on those things. But when it comes to the authority over things, the counties are the authorities. There are some states where that's not the case. There's some states where the Secretary of State's office is the one that's in charge of things. But there are no cases where the federal government dictates or can touch our voter list. That doesn't prevent the voter rolls from being public. The voter rolls are absolutely public, but access to them is not necessarily public. So there's information in the voter rolls. I think oftentimes you'll see, you've gotten campaign mailings before. I'm sure people get mailings from the different candidates. They get things when elections are going to happen. Some organizations get that directly from the counties because they can ask us for our voter roll list, and included in that would be the voter's name, the voter's address, and the voter's history. So they can mail you things. The phone numbers, email addresses, personal identifying information, that stuff is not public. We cannot give that information out. So mailing lists for certain often come from voter rolls. Sometimes they're overlaid with other demographic data that we don't have access to. That's like a proprietary thing that an organization will do. But when it comes to, like the voter rolls themselves being protected, they're maintained by us, held in a statewide system, but we also have to physically keep all of the voter registrations that come into our office, and we have to keep them forever. So we have those. If anything were to happen, we have paper copies of everybody's voter registration and all the updates that they've ever made. Okay. Any other questions on those things? I think we covered all of them at this point. Okay, so in Missouri, voter registration and processing of applications. So now we've got this framework for how we're going to work on things. Hello. We got this framework for how we're going to work on things. We've got the Help America Vote Act. We've got the National Voter Registration Act. And these things dictate what we do with the applications that come into our office. But there's also a few other things that we need to do as well. So once somebody becomes at least 17 and a half years old and they're a US citizen and a Missouri resident, as long as they're not serving a felony sentence and they're not adjudged incapacitated by the court, they can fill out a voter registration application. They can submit it to our office and we will process it. As we're processing it, it's going to get checked against the Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services. That's another thing that HAVA helped us do because we were required to get that kind of information. Same with the Missouri Department of Corrections, and then the Social Security Administration data and the Missouri Department of Revenue. So those interactions go exclusively through the statewide voter registration system, which is maintained by the Secretary of State's office. And all of that data sharing happens as a result of the Secretary of State's office working with these agencies. We benefit from that at the local level, and we get to utilize all of that within the statewide system. The statewide system is called MCVR, and it's something that we use every day when we're processing applications, making sure that people are alive, that they are that they actually exist, and that they are not disqualified in any way from being part of the voter roll. In order for us to process a record in general, and you don't have to necessarily see all the different parts of it, but this is an image of a voter registration card. It has to have, and this is like the bare minimum of what it has to have for us to be able to actually process it. So they have to check the box that says that they are a US citizen and that they're going to be at least 18 years old on or before Election Day. Those two boxes, very important to make sure that they meet the criteria to register to vote. Signing this is an attestation under law that they are eligible. And there's a little note on the bottom of every voter registration that says that if you make a false statement in this, that you can be imprisoned for up to 5 years with a $10,000 fine. So there is a pretty severe consequence to lying on this form. You have to have your full name on here, your residential address, including an apartment or room number. You cannot register to vote at a PO box. The whole purpose of being registered at a residential address is that we need to know where you live to know what you are eligible to vote on. If you are registered to vote at a PO box, that might be your mailing address, and you can give that to us as your mailing address, but you cannot just give us a PO box because we need your physical location to determine what districts you are in.
Does everyone in Missouri have an address, or are there communities that are still tied to PO boxes?
That is,
I know in other states I've seen that.
yes, that is a great question. So for the people on the Zoom, the question was, does everybody in Missouri have an address? No, they do not. And in some situations, especially in more rural counties, especially if they don't have 911 addressing, which we do, we benefit from in Boone, they may have their historical address, which is like the blue house next to the farm on this cross street. That is still a valid location because physically we need to know where you are. So there is a box on here, and it doesn't come up very often well, there used to be a full box, but it doesn't exist anymore. That basically says, can you give us an approximation of where you live? But you can also write that in that line. So where it says rural route and box and things like that, you can tell us physically where you are. And we have mapping. I mean, most counties have some sort of mapping because they need to for whatever reason, that they can locate where you are on there. And then within the statewide voter registration database, there is a way for us to put in a non-standard address and then link that to whatever precinct you're in. Because for election purposes, the organizational feature of every address is tied to a precinct. That precinct can be defined geographically, and then you can just determine what address points are within that precinct. So yes, that is for rural, especially for rural voters, but also for unhoused voters. If somebody is does not have a permanent physical location, then they can give us where they often are at their physical location. If they are often at a shelter, they can give us that. If they physically are often at an encampment, they could give us that address too. And we can triangulate where that is and put it in the precinct it's supposed to go to. Doesn't happen often, but it's legal, it's fine. It's part of the process that we go through if we get ones that are unhoused. Oftentimes, because our physical location of our address, so 801 East Walnut, that's the county clerk's office, is that we are physically in a downtown location. We're right next to Wabash bus station. It's a pretty centralized location, and lots of times people that are unhoused are in and around that area. They can be registered to vote at our address because that precinct is going to be the precinct that they are normally in. So we'll use that too sometimes. If you do, by the way, if you don't do any of these things, like if you don't give us a residential address or you don't give us the full name, we'll put you in pending status and we'll try to reach out to you and get you to update the information. We don't just reject these offhand and say, oh, you didn't fill it out. Too bad, that was your one shot. Like, we try to fix it and remedy by getting a hold of the voter. So once we've got your name and your address, we also need you, and this is part of the MVRA Act of 1993 and the Help America Vote Act. We need either your Missouri driver's license number or the last 4 digits of your social security number. And the reason for that is we're going to run those against the databases that we have to see if you are a real person. If you give us a non-Missouri driver's license number, if you've just moved here from Illinois, we do not have integration with Illinois' DMV. So that is not going to work. You have to give us either Missouri driver's license or the last 4 of your social security number. I'd say most of the time, the majority of the time, people give us the last 4 of their social because it's just a little easier for people to remember. That's how we check to make sure that they are a person against the Social Security Administration information. And then date of birth is also required, as well as signature. We can't accept them. We can't accept a new registration if it hasn't been signed, because that is another requirement of the law. We need to be able to keep your signature on file. Yes, there's a question.
I think I was asked if I supported the Missouri Constitution, to which I answered I had never read it. I was new in the state, and that sure, I supported it. Or some question of that nature when I was registering to vote. Or would that have been in another state where they asked me that?
That might have been in another state. That might have been in another state. What they may have said, because there is a certification on here that you meet all of the requirements under Missouri law and the Constitution, they could have asked for that to make sure that you were meeting all of the statutory and constitutional requirements for being registered to vote. But you do not have to sign an oath to the Constitution. That's something that if you're elected to an office, you have to swear into. But not when you're registering to vote. There is a question in the chat. It says, what happens to mailed ballots where the addressee is moved or is no longer present at that address? So we do not send out ballots to anyone unless they have applied for a ballot and have a reason to have a mailed absentee ballots. The only time we mail ballots is during absentee voting. They have to meet an excuse, like they're going to be out of town or they are incapacitated or have a disability. Those reasons would be enough to be able to ask for a mailed ballot. They give us the mailing address that they want it sent to. So if they're going to be absent because they're going to be out of town in South Carolina, they're going to give us the South Carolina address they're going to be at, but they're also going to give us their residence address so that we can confirm that they are registered in Boone County, that they reside in Boone County, and then we just simply mail it to the mailing address that they ask us to provide it to. So very, very, very rarely do we get any ballots that bounce back to us because people fill those out within 6 weeks of our elections. So it's very recent. So we don't have old information for mailing addresses because every election they have to reconfirm what their mailing address and their residence address is going to be. So if we do get it back, then we'll often reach out to the voter and see, did you forget an apartment number? Was there something on the mailing address that was incorrect when you provided it to us? And we will talk to them about it and see why that may have been the case. But for voter registration purposes, these are the main things that you need to have. If you don't have these things, you are in this pending status, which is kind of like a limbo status. We haven't rejected you because we don't have a reason to reject you. You're not unqualified or disqualified. We just don't have enough information to make a determination yet. Throughout the year, as we have your voter registration on file, you are then part of our voter list, our voter roll, and we do ongoing list maintenance to make sure that the voter roll continues to be up to date. So the Secretary of State's office will give us different reports that they have. They get that by working with the Social Security Administration, Department of Corrections, the courts and things like that. They will give us quarterly. Usually it's a little haphazard when it comes to the timing of when they send them to us, but we do get updates and reports from the Secretary of State's office that say things like, this person appears to be on your voter roll. It matches with 80% confidence or 100% confidence with this record that we have from the Social Security Administration that says that this person passed away. Look into that. So the Secretary of State's office can't act on these reports. They're just the conduit for giving us information. So they will send it to us and then we take action on it by reaching out to the voter or by looking for additional information to confirm that that person has passed away or that that person has moved. The national change of address is a USPS process. When you go to update your information with the post office, if you're going to move, we do not automatically get that information. I know that when you're filling out the form, if you do it online, it says, do you want to update your voter registration? We don't actually get that. I think some states do allow like immediate information, but the post office does not directly send us anything. Anything that we have related to changes at the post office comes through our ability to access the National Change of Address report. We can access that at the local level. We can access that through a report that the Secretary of State's office provides us, or in Boone County's case, we have a vendor that we use to basically look through our voter roll against the National Change of Address when we're sending out our sample ballots. So every time we go to send out sample ballots, we send out 110,000 sample ballots. We check that first against the National Change of Address because we're not going to send a piece of mail to somebody that person has already told the post office that they've moved. That would be a waste of money and pretty inefficient. So instead of sending them the sample ballot, we send them what's called a residence confirmation notice. And that is a forwardable piece of mail that would go to their new address that they gave that basically says, hey, we acknowledge that you have this new address, but we can't register to vote. We can't register you to vote at your new address until you confirm to us that that is in fact your address. So the little resident confirmation notice has a space for the voter to fill that out and say, yes, this is my address, or oh, I've moved, or I don't live in Boone County anymore, so you can remove me from the roll. Our updates that we use reports for require voter action as well. We can't do anything without the voter saying it, because otherwise we might accidentally take somebody off the roll that isn't supposed to be taken off the roll. It might have just been a temporary change of address that somebody put through the post office and didn't want it to affect their voter registration, which is totally valid. If you're only going to be gone for 2 months and you put in a Florida address, you don't want to be a Florida registered voter. You're only there for 2 months. If we took action and said, oh, that person moved to Florida, then that would be unfair to the voter. The voter is the one that needs to confirm that to us. The biennial canvas, which I mentioned during MVRA, that's that floor of how we keep things up to date. Sending out those sample ballots is how we use our biennial canvas. So those two, biennial canvas and sample ballot mailings, those are related to each other. But in Boone County, our sample ballot mailings are more regular than the biennial canvas. So anytime we have an election, we send out the sample ballot mailings. And we also, as a value add, send out the email sample ballots as well, which is a really great and cost-efficient way for us to proactively prompt voters to update their information. So of all of the emails that we send out, we will get responses back from a few hundred people that say, oh, I moved between the last election and now, please remove me from the roll. And we have an online form that they can fill out to remove themselves. Or if they've moved, they can tell us what their new address is and fill out a form to update that. Going back to your question about how states update information, there is the Election Registration Information Center, which is known as ERIC, is a system that the Secretary of State's office joined in 2018 in Missouri, but withdrew from last year in 2023. Recently, what the ERIC system is, it still exists, about half of the states in the country are in it. They have a nonprofit, they're kind of a nonprofit status board. The states that are a part of it make up the organizational board that controls it. They determine the rules for the security of it, what information is going to be shared in it, how the updates and the reports are going to get back to the states, and basically just how the whole thing runs. And all of the states that agree to be a part of it give their information into this center. And then, like if Missouri were to give information, it would be the voter list, but it would also be DMV information, any other kind of information that they think would be relevant. And then it gets matched against any of the information from other states. And if it hits a match, so if somebody's registered here and then they also find that they're registered in Colorado, then it would report back to the Missouri Secretary of State, hey, there's somebody here, there's somebody on your roll that is also registered in Colorado. Some of the information also includes the dates that happened. So then you can see which one was more recent. And then that report went back to the local election authorities, and we would get reports that would say, there's 500 people on your roll that also have comparable voter registrations in another state. Take action on that. And our taking action on that would be mailing or reaching out to the voters and saying, hey, it appears that you're registered in both of these places. Which one are you currently in? Which one's more current? Because oftentimes when people move, they don't think to tell the county they're moving away from, hey, I moved, take me off the roll. So they may do that in between the time that sample ballots or the biennial canvass happens. And so this was a faster way to get proactively to voters before they had to wait for the canvass, which costs more money for the local election authority because then you're sending out mailings. And this was a cost-effective way of doing it, which is why about half the states are still in it. We're no longer in it. There are other state information sharing kind of agreements. Other than being part of the ERIC system, The other way states can kind of share information is just by creating basic memorandums of understanding and then coming to a consensus on what information can be shared, what they're comfortable sharing, who can touch it, how it can be touched, how often they're going to give these reports. So each of the states can kind of come to that on their own. At the local level, there's really no way for us to do that. Like, I can't go independently engage the state of Illinois so that I can see what that is. It all has to go at the state level. So those types of things do exist. I think there's really only a handful of states that have done their own thing. Previously, there was a program called the Cross-State Match that a few states had tried to kind of get off the ground, and ERIC kind of took that place. So states can be part of ERIC, or they can do their own state information sharing, but that is, I think there's enough recognition that it's beneficial to know whether somebody's registered, even if it's legal. It's better if you're not registered in more than one state. So those are ways other states have kind of tackled that challenge. So obviously, there are a number of reasons why good list maintenance is helpful. And I just wanted to kind of pin these because I think they seem obvious, but there are some that maybe aren't as obvious. So one, obviously, protects against fraud. You don't want people voting in more than one state. You don't want people voting in more than one county. You don't want duplication on the rolls. You don't want old rolls. You don't want people that have passed away still on the rolls. So it is helpful in that regard, but it also is really helpful when it comes to budgeting and election costs. For example, the way that we prepare our election costs for the April election, I'll use as an example. Every entity that's on the ballot pays a proportional cost of what is on the ballot. And that proportion is based on the number of voters that they have. So if they have old voter records, they're going to have an inflated number of voters. They're going to pay more. And that's not fair to those entities. We want to make sure that on their behalf, we are keeping everything up to date so that they are being charged appropriately. And we also want to know, for our budgeting purposes, for when we're sending sample ballots, for example, we want to have the most up-to-date things so that we're not wasting money on mailings or wasting money ordering extra ballots that we don't actually need. So list maintenance is very helpful from that standpoint as well. It also improves the voting experience. It's one of those things I think that isn't super obvious from the outside, but it reduces waiting times. If you update your address with the post office and you don't update it with us and you go to your polling place thinking that everything is going to be up to date, you are going to have to wait because you're going to have to update your information at the poll. Other people are going to have to wait behind you. It's going to make for a longer experience for you and for other people that are at the poll. So that is not cool. We want to avoid that. We want to take care of as much before Election Day as we can. It also causes us to have fewer provisional ballots, because provisional ballots are really a catch-all for anybody that we haven't had the opportunity to fully investigate why they're not showing up on the voter roll. These are not the provisional ballots for photo ID. I'm talking about the provisional ballots of, we can't ascertain if you are eligible to vote right now at the poll. Vote this provisional ballot. It gives us time after the election to dig into what happens. More often than not, we get these provisional ballots because people say, well, I registered at the DMV. I don't know why you don't have my information. Or I thought I was registered. I don't know what happened. So it gives us time to be able to contact the DMV and see if they did in fact register at the DMV, or if there is some clerical data entry error that happened that prevented them from being on the roll. If we are able to ascertain those things beforehand, either by the voter realizing, hey, I haven't gotten a sample ballot in the last couple of elections. I wonder why that is. And they can reach out to us before Election Day, or you can use our website and look yourself up and see if there is current information for you on our voter roll. we try to provide not just our own list maintenance that we put out into the world, but also ways for voters to kind of self-service and tell us in advance if they're going to have an issue. And that's another reason why I think emailing out the sample ballots is so important, because we get emails from people all the time that say, hey, I tried to look myself up and it's not showing that I'm there, but I feel like I should be there. And maybe it's simply a data entry where you gave us a voter registration and we couldn't read if it was a 1 or a 4 in the way that you wrote your date of birth. And so your voter record is not correct because we couldn't read your handwriting. Or maybe you moved and you thought that you told us and we didn't get that information. So the more that we can do before election day, the more list maintenance we can do before election day, the better the voter experience is and the fewer provisional ballots people have. So lots of reasons why we want to have a good voter list maintenance program. Related to that, there was a question about in the case of unhoused or somebody that is no longer living where they were, what happens to an absentee ballot that's just kind of floating around with no one to accept them. So I cannot recall a time that we would have had an unhoused person that asked for an absentee ballot to be mailed to anybody. Mailing ballots just in sheer numbers is relatively small. There's a small number of them compared to the number that vote in person. So if you're an unhoused person that has moved and you want to vote absentee, you want to vote before election day for whatever valid reason that you have is, more often than not, they're going to come in person. They're not going to ask to have something mailed to them because they know they can't have anything really mailed to them because they don't necessarily have a mailing address. So if they're planning to vote, they're generally going to do it in person. We are not going to mail absentee ballots to ourselves. Like if they're registered to vote at our county office, we're not going to mail an absentee ballot to ourselves because we have in-person absentee voting that's there. So that's not going to happen. If it were to go to a place where someone no longer is, whether they were an unhoused person that's no longer there, or whether it is that, some emergency happened and you were planning to be in South Carolina, and then it turned out, oh no, I got in a car accident on my way to South Carolina and I've been in the hospital in one of the states between here and South Carolina, Tennessee, then it's going to bounce back to us because the address in South Carolina isn't going to be valid for you anymore either. So it's going to come back to us. We're going to reach out to the voter and see what the deal is and help you at that point.
But you, as I understand it, you have entirely electronic communications. You do not require a return in person of an application for an absentee ballot, for instance.
If you want it mailed to you?
Right.
Right. We are checking all.
You don't have to come back in person to give that to you in terms of ID, actual ID.
Well, you would mail it back, and we also can't provide you with an absentee ballot until after we've seen your ID. So if you are going to ask for an absentee ballot, in your voter record, it's going to have, there's a checkbox that says, have we seen your ID or not? And if we see your ID when you go to vote in person, when you go to vote at a poll, then that box is going to get unchecked. Or if you provide us with a copy of your ID when you register to vote, or when you request your absentee ballot, we're going to uncheck that. So there's no situation where we're not seeing an ID of a person before we've sent them an absentee ballot, because the checkbox actually prevents that process from even happening.
So that makes it possible that the invalid patient who can't get to bring in anything in person, it can be communicated.
Yes.
Very well, and it can be done well.
Yeah. So, and I'll repeat that for the Zoom people too. For anybody that is like housebound, that can't leave or has a disability, that is exactly how we communicate with them. They can mail us an application. They can do it online. However they want to get us an application. They sometimes will have like a family member drop it off too. And in any case, we'll still have needed to see the ID of the person requesting the ballot. So however we get that information, we still check that against their voter record. So it gets attached to your voter record. Anytime we send out an absentee ballot, there's an entry that's made on that person's voter record that says, today we sent out a sample ballot or an absentee ballot to them. And then when it gets returned by mail, or if they bring it back themselves, or if one of their close relatives brings it back, they can do that. We then check it back in, and then it'll say, we sent this out on March 5th. We received it back on March 10th, and then they are marked as having sent back their absentee ballot. They cannot vote again. So any kind of action that a voter takes, whether it's list maintenance, whether it's absentee, all of that's tied into their voter record and kept in the voter registration system. So we have a full record at all times of what voters are doing in relation to how they're updating their voter record and how they're participating in the election. Yeah, that was my last one of these. So the last thing that I really wanted to talk about were kind of what other states do, because the decentralized nature of elections is really great for a lot of things, I think. It's really helpful when it comes to making sure that we have a lot of safeguards in place, making sure that there's not a single point of failure that can happen. If something happens at the Secretary of State's office, it does not necessarily impact us. Like the other person that asked a question about the FEC or even the Election Assistance Commission at the federal level, if something happens at the federal level, does not necessarily affect us. But one of the drawbacks of decentralization is that it is very hard to explain, and it is very hard to then kind of, there's no general applicability when you're talking about other states. So if you see something in the national news that says people are being deleted from the roll just because they haven't voted, that's not going to happen in Missouri. You can't be deleted from the roll in Missouri just because you haven't voted. But in some states that is true. And that's because that state law is slightly different than Missouri's law. So I just wanted to, there were a few kind of individual ones that were unique that I wanted to point out that Missouri doesn't do, but there are states that do them. The states that you can be removed from if you have kind of not, even though MVRA explicitly prohibits states from removing somebody just because they have not voted, there are some, like Ohio, that has a slightly different process where they can skip over one of the original processes and then just kind of focus on people that haven't voted. So it's a little bit closer to being removed for not voting. It's not exactly being removed for not voting, but it doesn't have all of the protections that Missouri law does have in it. In 8 states, Alabama, Alaska, Iowa, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Dakota, West Virginia, and Wisconsin, inactive status is when we've gotten return mail back from you, you go into inactive status. You can still vote, but it indicates to us that you need to update your information. A voter has to be in that status for 8 years before they're canceled. That is a very long time. I think that speaks to the importance of having more proactive measures, because you can only imagine how out of date your voter roll is if that's all that you're relying on, which is why it's like the floor for doing list maintenance activity. Having an 8-year out of date record is really not ideal. So lots of times local election officials will do more than that. They don't just rely on that. But it is different than here. Yes.
What if somebody vandalizes and steals the ballots that are being mailed in to you, an absentee ballot? How can you deal with that?
So if an absentee ballot is tampered with and then it comes back to us, so every absentee ballot has to have the voter's information filled out on it and their signature. When it comes back in, we're checking that against the information that's on there.
Come at all. It's stolen and by some gang that's gone around and emptied the ballot.
And shredded, is that what you're saying?
Oh, like if they destroyed the ballots?
Yeah,
It wouldn't affect the voters, actually wouldn't affect anything. The ballots would be gone, but the voter wouldn't be marked as having voted, so we wouldn't have.
But they would be absent a ballot that they thought they should get, and they might never do anything about it.
They may reach out to us. I mean, there is no,
They might sit home waiting.
they might, yes, they might. And if that's the case, then I would encourage those people to reach out to us. If you have asked for an absentee ballot, because things happen with the mail where, things get lost in a post office. So the worst thing that ever happens to us during absentee voting is that people wait until the day before and say, well, I asked for my ballot like 6 weeks ago and I never got it. You can come in person and you can vote in person. You can vote at the polls. You can still vote. But if you're going to vote by absentee mail, it is also incumbent on you to make sure that you're letting us know if you didn't get that ballot. If there's something systemic, like if we have, well, for one thing, we have everything tracked. So if we see on our mail tracker that a batch of 50 ballots never got delivered, we're going to open a ticket with the post office and say, hey, why did those ballots not got delivered? And the post office is going to either tell us, I don't know, we delivered them, or something appears to have happened, we're going to look into it. So from our perspective, the important thing is making sure that the voter never loses their opportunity to vote. And if they're voting absentee, it's incumbent on them also, just like it's incumbent on us, to do things like put the trackers on and make sure that we have a good system. We didn't have tracking until 2020. That has been a lifesaver for us to be able to, when people call and say, where's my ballot? We can see where it is in the process and say oh, it's at St. Louis's post office. They just haven't given it to you yet. So if you are voting by absentee and you have not gotten that ballot, we would love to hear way earlier than possible.
Well, it isn't so much you have the ballot. I have the ballot in my possession. I vote and I send it in, but somebody stole it out of that mailbox. So they took
Oh, I see. When it's coming back to us?
you mentioned that if there's a batch seemed to missing, you will investigate it, but one of our popular or unpopular politicians claimed that the ballots were stolen. That's why he lost.
So if they're coming back to us and we don't receive them, we have a tracker on that too. And the voter can track their ballot coming back. So if they're checking their ballot, they can see whether we've received it or not. And if they get to the day before the election, we provide them with their tracking number. If they get to the day before the election and it's not showing that we've received their ballot, then they absolutely can go vote. They haven't voted. They haven't voted until we've received their ballot. So just because they put it in the mailbox does not mean they have cast their ballot. It just means that they have made the attempt to cast their ballot. So they have the opportunity to still be able to come and vote on election day. That's the important thing here, is that we're making sure that they continue to have that. So in their voter record, they're still marked as absentee sent. They're not absentee received. We haven't received their absentee ballot.
I don't know whether you've ever had to deal with somebody who vandalized, took out, just stole the ballots and burned them, or whatever.
Like from a post office?
Mhm.
Like from a post office box?
Yeah,
We have not had an incident where we've had a post office box been compromised. There certainly have been some. I think in Oregon and Washington, they've had that situation where the USPS box has been, in one case, firebombed. And in those situations, what the local election authorities did was try to take what they could out of the box and determine whose ballots they might have been based on what scraps of paper were left over, and reached out to those voters and said, hey, we know you tried to vote, so please try again. Please come vote on election day. Just so you know, we don't have your ballot anymore, so please come to vote again. The ones that are really hard to remedy in those situations are ones where they're out of town. Because if they're out of town and they mailed it back, then they don't have an avenue for being able to correct it. If they're a person that voted because they have a disability and they have a hard time getting to an office, then we can encourage them to try to find like a ride to get there. We have curbside voting, so they don't even have to get out of the car. But in situations where it's happened in other states, the best avenues have been to try to reach out to the voters if they've got that information after that situation happens, and then see what options are still available to them to make sure they still can cast their ballot. We haven't had situations where we just have, I mean, there's no way for us to reach out to every voter that hasn't sent back their ballot for us to say, hey, as a reminder, make sure you send back your ballot so that they can come back and say, oh, I did. I wonder where it went. But that's why the tracking has been such a game changer for us, because then voters can look at it and say, I put it in the mail like 4 days ago. I'm pretty nervous that I don't see that it's been delivered yet. Can you tell me if you've gotten it? Can you tell me if the post office has anything? And so we can reach out to the post office, but we also tell them all their other options, like they can come in person. We have curbside voting. We've got in-person absentee voting. All those things can still help make sure that they cast their ballot. There's also a question on the chat about if people are, so it's in the framework of students, but I actually think it applies to lots of people. If they are registered to vote in their old state or their home state, and then they also register to vote in Missouri. Like I said, that's legally allowed. You shouldn't be voting in both places. But let's say that you're registered or you're from a state that does do all mail-in voting like Oregon, and they're sending out their ballots to anybody that is registered to vote in Oregon. So ballot goes out in that person's name in Oregon. They're also registered to vote here. If they are going to vote here and they're going to get something mailed to them, then they're going to have to give us their reason for why they want it mailed to them. So if they're a student, for example, then they're going to have to say, well, I'm out of town. Like, I'm not in Boone County this day, so I want it mailed to wherever they are. So the first thing is both of the ballots would have to be mailed to the same address in order for them to have two ballots physically in their hands. But in order to prevent that from happening in the first place, that is where list maintenance is really important. That is where the data sharing groups like the statewide ones or ERIC system are the only way to prevent that. The only way for us to know that you are registered to vote both in Missouri and the other state is for us to have insight into that state. And the only way to have insight into the state is to have some sort of mechanism to do that. ERIC is one of those mechanisms. State information sharing is one of those mechanisms, but those literally are the only two ways. However, that is not to say that that would be a prevention of, that is the only way to prevent fraud from happening. That's how we make sure that the voter list will stay clean. But when it comes to people voting in more than one location, that is where all of the mechanisms that we have in place to check things when they come back to us. So the fact that in Missouri, you have to ask for a ballot for every election. We don't send them out automatically. So we have current information for you. So if you are back home in wherever you are from, or you've moved to wherever you're from, you've got to ask us for the ballot. You're not going to just automatically get one. When you fill it out, in almost all cases, unless you are voting because you are incapacitated or you're at home and you can't get out of your house, all other reasons require a notary. So if a person wants their Missouri ballot because they're going to be out of town, they have to go find a notary, present their ID to that notary, sign in the presence of the notary, have the ballot envelope notarized, and then send it back to us. So they've got to take that secondary action before they send it back to us. Otherwise, we're going to reject it. And then they're going to sign it and put all their information on it, and we're going to check that against the voter registration system. So if they're giving us back information on that ballot envelope that doesn't match what we have, whether that's because they've moved and they've put new information on it, or because somebody else has filled it out for them, or whatever it is, we're going to catch that when we are processing them back into their voter record. Because every time we get one back, we're pulling up a voter record for them and checking it against the information that we have. That is a proactive step. Like I said, the laws provide these kind of floors for us. We do additional things like, it came up in the last class, but signature verification, signature matching is not required by law in Missouri. But it is a best practice and something that we do because we think it's important to make sure that if the person is filling out that ballot, they're the ones that actually asked for the ballot and filled out the ballot completely. So signature matching and making sure that all that happens. That's what's happening on our side. For the other state that is providing it, like Oregon or Washington, they have their own mechanisms for making sure that things work appropriately. So if they are a full mail-in state, like Oregon or Washington, their signature matching is scaled significantly more involved than ours, because they know they have to have more protections in place because they're doing everything by mail. They have the resources to do that because they're not using the resources on finding election judges to work at polling locations. So they don't have that cost. They don't have that demand on them to set up polling locations and things like that. So all of their resources and attention are dedicated on their mail. So they have signature verification that they have software to do so that everything goes through the software first as a first check. And then they are looked at by individuals in their office or bipartisan teams, however they have that set up, to make sure that their signatures match on things. Am I saying that that does not catch people? Obviously, we've all seen that there have been people that have voted, I think most recently in St. Charles and in Florida, but they voted in person in St. Charles and by mail in Florida. So those are not things that the mail would have caught. They're things that would have had to have been caught during a list maintenance situation. But it is something that we keep at top of mind when it comes to all the different checkpoints that we put into our system. We could just send out a ballot and then it comes back. That's not a good system. That's why our laws are so good about all the checkpoints that we have. Missouri's law in particular is I consider one of the best when it comes to making sure that we have a good chain of custody, good best practices on things, both for absentee, because absentee is very limited anyway, unless you're voting in person. And any county clerk, I think if you talk to them in the state of Missouri, would much rather have in-person absentee voting than mail absentee voting, both because mail just has so many more steps in it. It requires so many more resources. It's more costly. It requires more time and attention than in-person voting. It's less resource heavy. It is the fact that you've got the voter coming in and you're looking at them and you're checking it against the ID, they like that part better. And it goes faster. The voter doesn't have to wait for their mail to come back and then send it back. They vote right then. They know they voted. Their process is done. They don't have to worry about it anymore. So all of those things are the ways to vote before election day. Going back just to like other little states that do things differently, I thought this one was interesting. Wyoming actually has the fastest removal process of any of the states. Failure to vote in a general election results in the cancellation of the registration. Wyoming's exempt from the MVRA, so they don't have to follow all the different criteria that's in there because of their same-day registration that they had at the time. So it's not a state that you think of very often, but Wyoming is the fastest removal process.
If you have the measles and you think you shouldn't be around people and you don't go vote, they're gonna knock you off.
Yes, and I think this speaks to the challenge of decentralized nature, because when you have something that is decentralized and it's not at the top. I think about voter registration every day, but in your day-to-day life, you're not thinking about voter registration. How you'd avoid that as a person in Wyoming would be to reach out to your county clerk and say, hey, I'm not going to vote, but I'll update my address and I'll keep something up to date so that you don't remove me. Why, as you're sitting in bed with the measles, would you think to do that? You probably would not. Because it's just hard to know every single detail of every single state's registration. And county to county even, things are slightly different. Even open office hours, we're open from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. That doesn't mean every county in the state is open from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. So I think it is a challenge for voters and list maintenance in particular. It's why it's important that we have these safeguards like the MVRA so that we're not taking people off that shouldn't be, but also so that there is some consistency when we can get it. And then just really briefly, I wanted to touch on, because I know that it's come up often, and I feel like I couldn't talk about list maintenance, at least without talking a little bit about the SAVE Act and the different ways that we are identifying like potential non-citizens and things like that. So, like I said, way back in the beginning, the completed application has to have a voter's checkmark confirmation that they are a U.S. citizen. Does that mean that we have access to databases that check to see whether those people are citizens? No, we do not. That is not something that is in our statewide system right now. County clerks in the state of Missouri unanimously agree that we would like to have access to that. It's not like that information doesn't exist in some capacity. Excuse me. When you apply for a real ID, you're proving to the Department of Revenue that you are a U.S. citizen. It would be really nice to have a check that we saw that we could use that for. But we cannot compel the Department of Revenue to do that. We cannot require anybody to share that information. So partly that means that there could be a law change that would help improve that. There could be something at the Department of Revenue that they could provide that. But that is an investment of time and resources that would have to happen. But it's something that we at the local level agree should happen. It would be very helpful if we're going to have this requirement to be able to check it, just like we do with the Social Security information and the DMV information that we do have. So that is one of the things that is coming up, I think, a lot nationally, that at the state level is also coming up in conversations. There's also ways that we could be utilizing federal information. It's not a perfect system because I think some people assume that we've got this like singular database of everybody that's a citizen in this country, and we don't. We have databases of people that are naturalized citizens, so people that have applied for citizenship and gone through the process, but birthright citizenship, we don't have a database of. So where we do have information, it would be helpful to be able to access it. There is information available. There is not a mechanism for us to be able to get to it. When it comes to creating new laws and new policies that impact us checking whether someone is a citizen or not, this is my personal opinion, is that we should leverage the information we do have. It would be very helpful to use what we already have available to us. We just can't right now. Or at least those agencies are not required to give us that information. So it would be really helpful, I think, for us to be able to get that information.
So I guess federal law says that if you're born in this country, no matter where you came from or what your status was, if you're born here, you are a citizen.
For birthright citizenship, yes.
Birthright citizenship, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, like, I was born in a hospital in New York. I have a birth certificate from New York. My name didn't go into some national database that said Brianna Lennon was born in New York and she is a citizen. So other than accessing information from me specifically as a voter, there is not a mechanism to be able to just easily check that. But I did apply for a real ID and I have a real ID. So if you wanted to check if I was a citizen, you could at a local level, if this was working the way that I think that it should be, the county clerk should be able to access whether this person has a real ID. It doesn't need to be incumbent on the voter to do that because we have that information available. If the DMV has information that says that I'm a citizen because I provided it to them, why not let the county clerks access that information and then be able to have citizenship information?
So federally, our president has said, we're gonna cancel that. If you're born here, that doesn't mean you're a citizen.
They're not 18 yet.
Yeah, I mean, when it gets to the point of them being voters, I think that that's when we will have a challenge. If that were to come to pass, I think it would be a challenge of then trying to figure out, okay, then what is the definition of a citizen? Because, I mean, we could get into the 14th and the 15th and the 13th Amendments about how the definition of citizenship has changed over time. Women and people of color were not ever considered citizens until we had constitutional amendments that said, yes, it's fine to be a citizen. If they were not defined as citizens before the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, they also didn't get to vote, which is why we needed the 19th Amendment for women and the Voting Rights Act. So all of these things are so intertwined. I think that conversation is very important to have. I think it's also really important from the administrative side of things and the election side of things to remember that there is information in the same way where it's very frustrating when you go to the DMV and you say, I'm providing you with all this information, which was provided by another government agency. And you go in and you go, why didn't the DMV just contact the health department and get this information? Or when you go to pay off your property tax bills, you go, this information was, or even the post office. Why is it that I can't access the post office change of address to update people's voter registration? Like, this is where I see the government has the potential to fix these things without having to burden a voter to do it. All that information exists. It's just not tied together. And things that allow us to access that information, we've shown improvements for. That's exactly what the Help America Vote Act did. Instead of saying to voters, hey, you have to go delete yourself in Callaway County before you register at Boone, the Help America Vote Act said, why doesn't Boone and Callaway just have the same system that they're working off of? And then we have a statewide voter registration system. And the county of Boone, whose job it is to make sure that the list is accurate, can pull in that Callaway information instead of making the voter do it. That's where I think the leveraging is really important. And where when we're talking about the conversation about proving citizenship and all those kinds of things, I don't want to lose the very important detail that while we don't have all of that information in databases and in places that are easily accessible, we're not even allowed to touch the data we do have. And we could start there, and that would be so much more efficient and advantageous for our voter rolls to keep them up to date and correct. But, you know, I'm not a policymaker, so I don't get to make that decision. It's just something that I want people to think about as they're hearing about different conversations about citizenship and voting. Those are areas that I would consider low-hanging fruit that we could fix and be in a better position than where we are now. Don't see any other questions on here. Got about 10 minutes. If anyone has any other questions, that was the last part that I really wanted to kind of touch on when it comes to voter list maintenance. So if you've gotten your sample ballot for the April election, you have been a participant in our voter list maintenance program. If you got a sample ballot for your child that moved away and you didn't return it to us, then we don't know that that child moved away. So if you ever get mail for somebody, it's always helpful to put return to sender on it and stick it back in the mail, because that's how we can most efficiently make sure that we keep our voter roll up to date. That's a question we get often, like, I keep getting the sample ballot. Well, until it gets returned to us, we're gonna keep sending you the sample ballot because we don't have any other information that they don't live there anymore. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'll give everybody back 10 minutes of their day. I'll leave that. Okay, thank you.